Hi, everyone. My name is Catherine Spears, and I did my research on an article called Stress Resilience, Illness, and Coping, which is a person focused investigation of young women athletes. And this is by Joyce Yee, Ronald E. Smith, and Peter Vitaliano. So, just a little background about the article. There's a lot of literature on stress and coping, which have received a lot of empirical attention in psychology, and the article noted that. One main focus on this study is resilience, which is an individual's capacity to maintain psychological and physical well being in the face of adversity. This has been seen in numerous studies of children who seem to rise above severe environmental changes or even a lot of high stressful trauma related situations. The study also focuses on potentially adaptive and maladaptive coping correlates of health and illness outcomes in young athletes who have recently experienced high levels of life stress. Another focus on the study is coping will involve cognitive and behavioral measures designed to master, tolerate, or reduce external and internal demands of conflicts. So the study investigated resilience among high school female athletes rather than male athletes, which there are a lot of studies that focus on male athletes and stress and trauma and coping. So this study really wanted to gear into the female side and how they coped with a lot of things. So this focused on stress illness relations rather than stress injury relations. So they really wanted to focus on stress induced sicknesses rather than stress induced injuries. And an interesting part about this is that they used a person focused approach, which helped them predetermine which groups that were going to be non resilient or resilient. And this was used to identify different types of variables that will differentiate each group. The sample consisted of 404 female high school student athletes who were on varsity teams from 13 different schools. And obviously, if you're an athlete, you're in different sports. So they looked at different sports, and all the athletes participated in questionnaires in group sessions during their preseason, and then their behaviors were followed throughout their season. What's interesting is that the researchers noted that 127, when they conducted the questionnaires and did their comparisons, 127 female athletes reported that they experienced between 17 and 46 major negative events within the past year. So I'm going to explain to you how they came about that. So there are four different measures in the study, well, three different measures in the study: stressful life events, coping strategies, and illness. So the first one is stressful life events, which is assessed by a modified version of adolescent perceived events scale. And this scale looked into the number of experienced life events that were considered either negative or positive, and they used 198 non related life events that could help with the study. They also looked into coping strategies, which were assessed by the WOCC, or Ways of Coping checklist. They specifically used six subscales and divided those up in maladaptive and adaptive forms of coping. So the adaptive forms of coping are problem focused coping, seeking social support, and minimizing threat. And problem focused coping is making a plan of action and actually following through with it rather than giving up in total. Seeking social support is looking for tangible assistance, actually going out and talking to someone about your feelings rather than keeping it bottled up. And then minimizing threat is just accepting your fate almost and just saying, there was nothing I could do about it, but I'm going to accept it. The maladaptive forms of coping are wishful thinking, blaming others, and avoidance. Wishful thinking is pretty much wishing the whole situation would have went away, or wishing it would never happen, or wishing that they would essentially go away and just disappear. Blaming others is not really taking responsibility for one's actions, but placing the blame on someone else, giving the responsibility towards someone else. And avoidance is just totally forgetting about it, don't want to hear about it, it's not important at all. And they measured this basically using a 4-point Likert scale, which is 0, which would be never, and then 3 would be regularly. And they were asked to indicate the extent in which they use these coping strategies based on the negative life events that they face. Another measure that they used was illnesses. So the researchers looked at illnesses based on attendance records from practice that were given to them by coaches. And this was divided up by excused absences versus non-excused absences. So excused absences were based on illnesses or injury. Non-excused is like things like academic probation or homework or just had a family emergency, and those were non-excused. So that was a very interesting type to me. And the results yielded, so before I get into the results, they ended up dividing the groups into resilient and non-resilient groups eventually, because that's what they wanted to focus on. So their sample size got decreased a lot. So they ended up having a sample size of 42 resilient high school females and then 28 non-resilient high school females. And so the results yielded that profiles of coping strategies or strategy choices were compared to resilient and non-resilient groups, and there was a stronger tendency to use adaptive coping strategies than maladaptive. And this was seen between both groups, but when you look into the chart, if you guys decide to read the article or look at the article, if you look at the chart, you can see that in the resilient group, they used more positive and adaptive forms of coping rather than the non-resilient group who focused more on high percentages in using negative forms of coping or maladaptive forms. So the resilient group used 27.4% of problem-focused coping, 23.8% of seeking social support, and then wishful thinking at 33.3%, which is high. The non-resilient group used 39.3% of wishful thinking, and then 19.1% of blaming others, and 17.9% of problem-focused coping. So they were more negative than positive compared to the resilient group. And then the researchers also examined the correlations among the WOCC subscale scores of the groups to determine if the coping strategies were differentially related. So they found out that problem coping and seeking social support were positively correlated, and that's seen especially amongst the resilient group. In the non-resilient group, more so blaming others and problem-focused coping had positive correlation. And that's all I got. Thank you.